Hello and welcome and Happy New Year to you from me, Michael Scott in Oxford, UK. Thank you for joining us for this sixth event in the second year of our Christian Literary Imagination series. The series is a Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today, my co-convener for the series, Father Joseph Simmons, SJ, from Campion Hall, Oxford, will be welcoming Professor Barbara Mujica from Georgetown University, who will be talking about St. Teresa of Avila. After her talk, Barbara will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience and put to her by Father Joe. We would encourage you to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using your Q&A key at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them and we will endeavour to answer them either today or later by email. I'm really looking forward to today's talk and to the discussion, and I'll see you again at the end. Over to you, Father Joe.
Thank you, Mike. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Barbara Mujica, a professor emerita of Spanish literature at Georgetown, where she taught early modern Spanish literature with a specialization in the Spanish mystics, in women's writing, and in Spanish theater. She's quite prolific. Her most recently scholarly book is entitled Religious Women and Epistolary Culture in the Carmelite Reform, The Disciples of Teresa de Avila. Her other scholarly books include Women Writers of Early Modern Spain, Sophia's Daughters from 2004, Teresa de Avila, Lettered Women from 2008, and more recently, Collateral Damage, Women Write About War from 2020. Professor Mujica is founding editor of Comedia Performance, a journal devoted to early modern Spanish theater. At Georgetown, she was awarded a Presidential Medal, the School of Languages and Linguistics Service Medal, and the Dean's Medal for Excellence in Teaching. Dr. Mujica is also a fiction writer and essayist. Her latest novel, Miss Del Rio, is scheduled for publication later in 2020 by HarperCollins. Barbara has also edited a new book to be published this year by Vernon Press on staging and stage decor, in which both Michael Collins, who has presented for our series and will again, and Mike Scott, our fearless leader, also have chapters. Now, if this is what you're able to do, Barbara, in retirement, I can't imagine what you were doing in your productive years trying to get tenure. Today, Professor Mujica is presenting on Teresa de Avila's Las Moradas, often titled The Interior Castle in English. Teresa refers to the soul as, quote, a castle made entirely out of a diamond or a very clear crystal, in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven. There are many dwelling places. We're excited and fortunate to have Professor Mujica unpack this rich image and tell us a little bit about the history and import of Teresa de Avila in Spanish mysticism. Professor, over to you.
So first of all, I want to thank Global Events for the opportunity to speak. This is a wonderful invitation. I only wish I could be in Oxford in person to see the marvelous architecture I've admired so often in photos and on television. However, COVID made that impossible. And having seen the entire Endeavour series on TV, I must admit I would have been a little afraid to set foot on the Oxford campus. In the series, visitors to Oxford often come to no good end. So with COVID and lurking criminals everywhere, we live in very stressful times. Every day we read about the Russian military buildup along the Ukrainian border, the threat of Russian troops in Cuba and Venezuela, the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons, a potential Chinese takeover of Taiwan. And at times like these, we really seek relief from the constant anxiety. We need a refuge. Teresa de Avila also lived in tumultuous times. Lutheranism was tearing Christian Europe apart. In the Americas, Teresa's brothers were facing untold dangers, advancing the interests of the Spanish crown. In Spain, the Inquisition persecuted those suspected of heterodoxy or spurious raptures, especially women. As an ecstatic and the daughter and granddaughter of conversos, that is converts from Judaism, Teresa was constantly under suspicion. Furthermore, opposition from the Carmelite hierarchy to the new religious order that she founded, the Discalced Carmelites, put her squarely on the defensive. And during the last years of her life, the Catarro Universal, a global pandemic that, like COVID-19, spread like wildfire, claimed the lives of several of her friends. In the midst of often harrowing experiences, Teresa sought refuge in her own soul, her interior castle, where she found spiritual peace. For Teresa, God was the ultimate refuge from the cares of the world. And prayer provided the entry into the depths of the soul where God resided. In Las Moradas, sometimes translated as the interior castle and sometimes as the mansions, Teresa describes the process of moving inward, taking refuge from worldly concerns and concentrating on one's awareness solely on God. Concentrating one's awareness solely on God. She structures her book around the metaphor of the soul as a castle made entirely out of a diamond or a very clear crystal, in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven there are many dwelling places. Through the process of recollection, that is moving inward, the soul moves into itself. Through the circles, gradually detaching itself from the world as it approaches its refuge. A phenomenon we cannot understand, explains Teresa, because the nature of the soul is beyond our comprehension, just as God is beyond our understanding. Prayer is not a function of the intellect, she insists, but of the soul's yearning for God and of God's love for mankind. The castle consists of 7 concentric circles or dwelling places, each of which contains many rooms or mansions. For, as Kiernan Kavanagh explains, the spiritual life that goes on within the castle is a complex matter involving the individual's capacities, the diversity of ways, and different spiritual depths. It is important to remember that the interior castle is not a manual on how to achieve a mystical experience. Such a thing would be impossible, as God, not the individual, determines who will be graced with union, but a description of a process that will be experienced in different ways by different people. The circles of the castle are arranged symmetrically. The 3 outer circles correspond to the active or meditative stages of prayer, during which the soul displays agency. The individual can read spiritual books, gaze at the image of a saint, gaze at a cross, or engage in other devotional activities that stimulate the process of moving inward. The 4th circle is a transitional space. It is a place of pain for the soul, which cannot advance further on its own. The 3 inner circles correspond to the contemplative or passive stages of prayer. As the soul advances through the inner circles, the faculties are suspended and the soul surrenders entirely to God's love. The door that admits the soul to the castle is prayer. The first step is always the hardest, writes Teresa. The greatest labor is in the beginning. In the book of her life, she compares the prayer process to planting a garden, which in the beginning is very difficult. Pulling up the weeds, first of all, choosing a spot, pulling up the weeds, watering, so forth. Deciding where and when to pray and disciplining oneself to a routine, a prayer routine, can be daunting, especially because at this stage, one is still committed to the things of the world. On the periphery of the castle, reptiles, poisonous insects, and other pests constantly circle, threatening to penetrate the outermost rooms. These are the temptations and vanities, wealth, ambition, fame, tenure, the distractions that try to lure us away from our journey out toward the divine within. For some souls, they are an insurmountable obstacle. These souls are destined to remain outside the castle because, writes Teresa, they are so ill and so accustomed to being involved in external matters that they have no remedy. They are so used to dealing always with the insects and vermins that are in the wall surrounding the castle that they have become like them. The servants of the castle, the senses, which serve as mediators between the soul and the world, reside in the first dwelling places, which means that in the early stages of prayer, the soul is not completely divorced from everyday concerns. It must struggle to free itself from the distractions of everyday life, the demands of career and family, routine obligations such as paying bills, filling the gas tank, which constantly intrude on our consciousness. Once these are banished from our minds, the soul can finally advance. Still, the journey inward is arduous and fraught with obstacles. Not all souls progress at the same rate. The path is not straight, and progress is not assured. Sometimes the soul regresses, falling backward into the preceding circle. Sometimes it stands paralyzed or wanders from one mansion to the next in the same circle, for the pests it believed to have left behind still pursue it. We have no control or understanding of why some people enjoy certain favors and others not. Teresa writes, God doesn't grant them, that is, favors, because the sanctity of the recipients is greater than those who don't receive them, but so that his glory may be known. The outcome ultimately depends on God, not on our own efforts, she explains. Yet the benefits of prayer make the inward journey well worth undertaking. The important thing, she stresses, is not to set an agenda for ourselves or for God, but to yield to God's will. That is, to bring our will into conformity with God's will. As one soul proceeds through the castle, one grows in mindfulness, and the desire to do good, that is, to conform to God's will, increases. The dwelling places that are furthermost from the center remain in relative darkness, for they receive little of the light from the innermost rooms, although it is always shining within. Teresa writes, it should be kept in mind here that the fount, the shining sun that is the center of the soul, does not lose its beauty and splendor. It is always present in the soul, and nothing can take away its loveliness. But if a black cloth is placed over a crystal, that is the sun, obviously the sun's brilliance will have no effect on the crystal, even though the sun is shining on it. God is always present within us, she explains, but if we allow ourselves to be distracted and indulge in sin, we place a black cloth over our souls, and they no longer reflect God's light. Those who reach the second dwelling places have begun to understand the dangers of worldly beings, of worldly things. At this stage of prayer, the intellect plays an important role in the process of detachment that is necessary for the castle to become a true refuge. Understanding enables us to look within and recognize our own sinfulness, which leads to humility, a virtue that is essential for spiritual progress. The deeper we penetrate into the castle, that is, the deeper we become immersed in prayer, the purer and more perfect the mansions become. Having already made considerable progress, Those who reach the third dwelling places feel an increased resolve to continue the journey, what Megan Dawn calls spiritual perseverance. They also experience a heightened awareness of their own free will, which they strive to place in conformity with God's will by serving others. God, God of love must not be fabricated. Excuse me. Love of God must not be fabricated in our imaginations, but proved by deeds, insisted Teresa. This does not mean becoming judgmental or imposing our will on others, explains Dawn, but rather stepping outside the place of good intention and being available for others. Thus, the third dwelling places can be seen as a space of greater mindfulness, intentionality, and personal integration, characterized by growing consistency and predictability as a human being. The journey of the soul into itself is a process of letting go. The soul that reaches the fourth dwelling places has achieved a degree of detachment, and with it, an inner tranquility. Earthly trials do not disappear. Pests continue to circle the castle, but they become bearable. One can deal with them with dispassion. And in fact, doing so strengthens the soul. Any disquiet and war can be suffered if we find peace where we live, writes Teresa. In this stage of the journey, supernatural experiences begin, she explains. Rather than engaging actively in prayer, the soul rests, allowing God's grace to work on it. In the early stages, the soul works almost continually within the intellect, engaging in good discursive thought and meditation. But now, the important thing, writes Teresa, is not to think much, but to love much. Teresa tells her spiritual daughters, leave the soul in God's hands. Let him do whatever he wants with it. By opening itself more fully to God and God's love, the soul becomes better able to feel compassion and to want to serve others. At this point, the soul yearns to continue its journey, but can do so only with God's acquiescence and assistance. In the fifth dwelling places, the soul enters into the contemplative state, the prayer of union, which represents a critical moment in its trajectory. Most who have come this far will be granted access to the fifth circle, Teresa assures us, but they will experience it in different ways. Now, the soul comes into a more profound understanding of God's love. The faculties are suspended. The soul has died to the world as to live completely in God. Thus, the death is a delightful one. Delightful, for the soul is now in God and God is in it. The experience defies words, writes Teresa, and so, as is her custom, she has recourse to a metaphor. The soul is like a moth that is drawn to a flame and is consumed by it. However, the soul does not lose all agency upon entering the fifth dwelling place, for it opens itself relationally to allow for divine activity to operate in it, writes Gillian Algren. As Edward Howells puts it, the soul does not become an automaton with no free will of its own. On the contrary, the soul sees its action as self-chosen, even though they come from God's will. The transformation that occurs in the fifth dwelling places requires the soul to acquiesce to God's intervention. By doing so, the soul becomes aware of its new identity as one of God's chosen. The human person is now consciously theonomous, subject to God's authority, writes Algren, and this new awareness encompasses a new sense of relational identity. The soul's transformed transformed relationship with God heightens its awareness of its connection with other people, intensifying its desire to serve. In the sixth circles, the soul undergoes final preparations to enter the king's chamber. This is the longest and most theologically complex section of Las Moradas, in which Teresa chronicles the expansion of the soul as the soul comes to know God mystically. Here, Teresa describes the graces God bestows on the soul, including raptures, which draw it out of its senses. For if it were in control of its senses, she writes, upon feeling itself so close to God, it might die. She explains that it takes courage to surrender to this state. For the nearness of God can be frightening, overwhelming. Here, Teresa develops the metaphor of the mystical marriage to convey the notion of the soul, the bride, and God, the bridegroom, completely surrendering to each other and becoming one. The surrendering of the self causes the bride distress, she writes. The soul truly suffers a form of disintegration in the six dwelling places because it is undergoing a final purification that threatens its identity as an individual. This last description is from Gillian Algren. But it is this dissolution of the self that makes possible the transformation of the soul, enabling it to endure the persecutions of the outside world. When Teresa writes of persecutions, she's referring to harassments, health problems, fears, and personal anguish suffered during her lifetime, the kinds of trials we all endure, from aggravating bosses, bigoted colleagues, illness, or the death of a loved one. But the soul is approaching the seventh circle, the place of safety. It will emerge renewed and better able to cope with stress-producing circumstances. The danger in the six dwelling places is that the soul will become so lost in contemplation that it will disengage from the passion, the physical presence of the suffering Christ. Teresa warns that it is essential not to withdraw through one's own efforts from all our good and help, which is the most sacred humanity of our Lord Jesus Christ. For the soul to be truly wedded to Christ in the seventh dwelling, it must assimilate God into its being. It must embody the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Son, Jesus, being fully divine and fully human. Thus, the transformation of the soul requires it to be fully engaged in both senses of the word with Christ, the Godhead. Teresa's insistence on the humanity of Christ positions her securely within Catholic orthodoxy and distances her from strict apophaticism. The first chapters of Las Moradas unfold within the framework of apophatic prayer, which involves eliminating all images and sounds from the mind, so that the soul sinks into a superessential darkness where it encounters the blinding light of God. Apophatic spirituality disallows any rational understanding of God and all anthropomorphic descriptions of God. Because it is associated with Alumbrados, a sect that was considered heretical in Spain and was seen as a dangerous manifestation of spiritual autonomy, apophaticism aroused the suspicion of the church. Christianity revolved around the incarnate Christ, the physical presence sensorially accessible to human beings, which made apophatics' conviction that accessibility to God required transcending the senses highly problematical. Long before she wrote Las Moradas, Teresa defended the criticality of the sacred humanity of Christ in chapter 22 of her life, arguing that while for some authors, meditating on images is an obstacle to achieving divine illumination, for her, the rejection of Christ's humanity as revealed through the senses is intolerable. Teresa's devotion to the sacred humanity of Christ may have been intensified by her association with the Jesuits, whose spiritual exercises guide the individual into a state of interiority by means of visualizations of scenes from the gospel. Images of Christ in his humanity and Christ as bridegroom abound in the seventh dwelling places. When the Lord is pleased to have pity on his soul, on this soul that he has taken spiritually as his spouse because of what it suffers and has suffered through its desires, he brings it before the marriage is consummated into his dwelling place, which is the seventh, writes Teresa early in the section. The bride, who has been yearning for her beloved, is literally lovesick, sick with love. She has been longing for refuge from her pain and anxiety. Now, at last, union takes place in the very interior center of the soul, which must be where God himself is. The experience is so transcendent that it defies words. What God communicates here, writes Teresa, to the soul is an instant is so great and a favor so sublime, and the delight the soul experiences so extreme that I don't know what to compare it with. Spiritual marriage is different from spiritual union, explains Teresa. For in the latter spiritual union, the lovers can separate. The soul always remains with its God in the center. Let us say that the union is like the joining of two wax candles to such an extent that the flame coming from one of them becomes part of the flame of the other. But afterward, one candle can easily be separated from the other. The former, however, marriage, is like rain that falls into a river. All is water. For the rain that fell from heaven cannot be divided or separated from the water of the river. They are one. God is forever in the soul, and the soul in God. It is this secret refuge within one's own soul that one, it is within this secret refuge within one's soul that one ultimately finds freedom. Like a butterfly that approaches a candle and is consumed by flame, the soul that approaches God is consumed by a conflagration of love. It loses awareness of the physical self and yields entirely to God's will. It senses a deep interior joy that makes it indifferent to discomfort. However, explains Teresa, detachment from the body does not mean that one should stop eating, that one should want to die. The desire to be with God should not produce a desire for death. On the contrary, the graced soul desires to live and serve God. This means serving others, helping the crucified, that is, those who are suffering. Thus, the mystical experience is galvanizing. It leads not to inertia, but to activism, creativity, and social engagement. Although mystical marriage lasts only a moment or two, the experience transforms the soul forever. The concepts Teresa sets forth in the interior castle are not mere abstractions, explains Algren. The journey through the castle, the search for refuge from the trials of earthly existence, produces a new self-knowledge. Starting in the fifth dwelling places, the soul undergoes a radical transformation of selfhood. Algren believes that Teresa was quote, deeply concerned about the kind of person one becomes through the relationship with God. Opening our hearts to God spurs us to become active partners in the task of revitalizing the human community, she argues. We become more responsive and resourceful and better equipped to effect change. It was Teresa's profound experience of God's presence in the soul that galvanized her to found a new religious order, the Discalced Carmelites. Having enjoyed God's favors herself, Teresa yearned to provide other women with a truly spiritual environment where they could devote themselves to prayer. At the time, Spanish convents were often overcrowded and lax. Nuns from aristocratic families maintained their titles and demanded special privileges. Wealthy nuns enjoyed many material comforts and sometimes entered the convent with servants or slaves. Often, groups of women from one family or social circle joined the same convent, which contributed to cliquishness, gossip, and petty rivalries. Encarnacion convent, where Teresa took vows, followed the mitigated or relaxed rule, which meant that nuns could leave the convent to visit their families or conduct personal business. No time was set aside for mental prayer. In contrast, the new order followed the unmitigated Carmelite rule, that is, the original teachings of the early Desert Fathers. While Spanish convents mirrored the hierarchical structure of society, the Discalced Carmelite convent was conceived as a refuge from society. Discalced Carmelite nuns lived in poverty, cultivated obedience, austerity, and simplicity to devote themselves entirely to God. They relinquished their titles and their social identity. While women typically took their father's last name and then, after marriage, their husband's, Discalced Carmelite nuns disassociated themselves from the male power structure by taking a new name. For example, Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada became Teresa de Jesus. Maria Carrion writes that the withdrawal of the nun into the convent reflects the inward movement of the soul seeking God. Just as entering the castle is a liberating experience for the soul, entering the convent is, in Teresa's view, a liberating experience for the individual nun. The convent is not a prison, but a refuge. A refuge from the cares of everyday life, where women can devote themselves entirely to prayer. Carrion points out that the castle described by Teresa is actually an alcázar, a walled fortress, a space governed by God where one can take refuge. Unlike letrados, lettered men, university-educated men, who studied scripture and practiced a more cerebral spirituality, women who did not receive a university education usually practiced affective spirituality, which depended on the emotions rather than the intellect. By founding convents, Teresa validated women's prayer practices and defended their right to pursue higher forms of spiritual activity. Teresa founded 17 convents. For her, the spiritual journey entailed making conscious decisions that brought one to act in conformity with God's will. Spreading the reform to promote an authentic relationship with God was a spiritual mission, a commitment, and an undertaking of self-actualization. Teresa understood that spiritual selfhood requires the individual to take a stand and to take risks. In the face of venality in the church, venality in the church and fierce opposition to the Carmelite reform in the Carmelite order, making foundations was for her a form of activism, even of militancy. Throughout her writing, Teresa uses martial language, often urging her nuns to be strong soldiers in the battle against both enemies of the reform and the enemy of the soul, the devil. Men could propagate and defend the faith actively through preaching, missionary work, or fighting infidels in foreign lands, but women could do their part as well. They could pray, which Teresa saw as a form of combat. Jody Billenkoff writes, if male clerics engaged in active apostolates, Discalced Carmelite nuns could exercise an apostolate of prayer. But to increase their impact, Teresa needed more foundations. It is a paradox of mysticism that the castle is a refuge from worldly affairs, yet prepares us to better engage in worldly affairs. By acquiescing completely to God's will, by losing ourselves in the divine, we do not suffer annihilation, but become active participants in society. Taking refuge in our own castle does not make us selfish, but selfless. Today, Teresa is reaching an ever-growing audience as the current climate of disillusionment with conventional religion has ignited an explosion of popular interest in alternative approaches to faith. During the past 2 decades, a plethora of new books, films, and CDs about Teresa has appeared all over the world. Although Teresa was a woman of her own times with misconceptions and the biases that characterized the 16th century, her insight into human nature, including the individual's deep-seated need to find emotional, psychological, and spiritual peace, speak to us today, no matter what faith tradition we follow, or even if we follow none at all. In today's troubled world, we all seek refuge. Teresa teaches us how to find it within. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for an illuminating talk, you might say. We've had a number of questions come in. I might begin just by asking a question. There's sort of the traditional view of the stages of spiritual growth, the sort of purgative, illuminative, and unitive. And you touched on some of those. And I wondered, would you say those neatly graphed onto the 7 dwelling places?
I think it's very hard to neatly graft anything onto anything when we talk about spirituality. There have been a number of analyses of the interior castle that talk about the steps, and they don't always divide them the same way. What I would say, actually, that this is much clearer in the writings of St. John of the Cross when we talk about those stages. I think with Teresa, there's a lot of back and forth and backsliding. I mean, it's clear that there's a purgative
dimension,
or stage, and then the illuminative stage at the end. I mean, certainly they're there, but I've seen so many different explanations that divide them different ways, that I would say dividing Teresa into into hard and fast stages is dangerous.
Right.
It risks. I think it risks oversimplifying her teachings.
Sure. Yeah, like trying to fit her into a preformed
box. Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned the kind of the difference between union with God and marriage, because she begins with that, the idea of being engaged with God, but then to make a distinction between marriage
Yeah,
from.
and that's her distinction. That's not something I invented. That she makes that very clear in in the beginning of the seventh circles, the seventh dwelling places. She makes that distinction very clear.
Good. We have a question from someone in the audience, Dan Dixon, who, if it's the Dan Dixon I know, hello, Dan, a Jesuit in formation from the Midwest of the United States. Dan writes, I'm interested to know more about your experience of translating Teresa and other early modern Spanish literature into English. Have you encountered any challenges in expressing key ideas or uncovering new meanings or understandings in this process of translation?
Okay, so I have not translated works by Teresa. I just translated a 1,000-page book by Vicente Rodriguez on St. John of the Cross. And I can tell you that the translation process is very, very, very tedious. However, I've worked with translations of Teresa because in order to speak about her in English, I need to use translations, and I've used the translation by Kieran Kavanaugh and Otilo Rodriguez. And I have sometimes retranslated parts of that because I find that it's first of all, Teresa writes. She uses very conversational language. She uses a lot of expressions that even modern Spaniards don't use today. So when I teach this course on Teresa in Spanish, and I often have a lot of native-born Spanish speakers, and I often have a lot of Spaniards in the course, they don't understand the text. The text is difficult, not only because it deals with difficult ideas and concepts that are rather alien to today's way of thinking, especially when we talk about relinquishing the free will and things like that at the beginning, which he talks about that as we enter the inner circles. And then doubles back and says, well, we don't completely relinquish the free will. But all these discussions of grace and free will are difficult to begin with. But then when we get to Teresa's language, she uses a lot of slang. She uses a lot of proverbs, a lot of, she makes a lot of reference in her metaphor. She makes a lot of reference to objects, foods, articles of clothing, materials that we don't use anymore. So we don't know those words. I found when I was doing my translation of the book on St. John of the Cross, I came across that even more because there were a lot of legal terms, there were a lot of theological terms. And so, yeah, those are some of the problems that you come across when you try to translate the works of a 16th century Spanish writer into, to make it intelligible for a 21st century audience.
Another question regarding translation. You talked about mindfulness, and as one kind of moves through the castle, they move towards greater mindfulness and the desire to do good. Is that word, would that be like conciencia, or what exactly would the word be for mindfulness? That seems like more of a kind of a modern.
Yeah, it is a modern word, and the word, and that doesn't occur. That word does not occur in the translation by Kavanaugh. Rather than use a word, she uses conciencia, but she more often describes, and often through metaphor, what she means. So mindfulness is kind of a buzzword today. It's used in psychology. It's used in it's actually used in military training. It's used it's used in it's used in psychotherapy. It's used in all kinds of things. I don't think conciencia was that kind of buzzword, and I don't. And although she uses it, it doesn't have the same impact that mindfulness has today. So what she does is explain. she says things like, now we grasp, or now we understand, or now we perceive God's presence in us. And now we're more aware of the people around us. She describes what she's talking about.
Okay. We have a couple of questions that relate to history and sourcing. The one on history comes from Angela Preston, who comes to a number of our talks. She says that Teresa was able to found 17 convents in an advocacy that was seen as a rebellion. What do you think that why do you think she was able to create change within the Catholic Church at her time?
I think we have to realize that Teresa just was not born out of nothing. There was already a Catholic reform underway in the church at the time, and Luther wasn't born out of nothing either. There was, from the 11th century, there was a monastic reform. People realized that there was a lot of corruption in the church, and there was a lot of bureaucracy in the church, and there was a move towards simplification and to finding a more authentic expression of Christianity way before Teresa. The Devotio Moderna, which is really a 14th century movement, started in Northern Europe, but had immense impact in Spain. And Jimenez de Cisneros, who was Queen Isabel's confessor, was very exposed to the Devoción Moderna, and he was very exposed to the ideas of Erasmus, who was exposed to these new ways of thinking. The Devoción Moderna, for those who are not familiar with this term, was a movement that sought a more authentic, primitive kind of Christianity, and so people would they would retire from the urban areas, and they would sometimes go out, men and women, into more natural surroundings. Often there was no leader to the group, and often there was no clergy. Sometimes Franciscans, Reformed, that is, unmitigated Franciscans would join them, but the idea was to find a more authentic form of Christianity that wasn't corrupted by all the material interests that were affecting the church at that time. And the movement was extremely popular. Cisneros was taken by it. He invited Erasmus to come to Spain. That didn't happen for a number of reasons, but he influenced the Queen, and this movement really among the noblewomen especially really took off, and it was the rage in the early 16th century, the end of the 15th century, the early 16th century in Spain. But what happened? Luther happened. And then when Luther starts preaching a kind of spirituality that is in some ways similar to this new kind of spirituality, when he starts talking, as they did, about discarding the paraphernalia, the externals of prayer, and going back to a more authentic kind of prayer, and is disassociating himself from the Pope, and talking about being able to have a direct conversation with God. Then this new spirituality becomes dangerous. Teresa writes precisely that prayer is a direct conversation with God. People prayed before Teresa. I mean, this sounds almost unbelievable that her idea was radical, but they prayed by reciting prayers. So people would learn how to recite prayers. They would pray the hours. Every hour they would say a prayer, and so women especially were supposed to engage in recited prayers, which she called vocal prayer, and it was a prayer that didn't require you to think; it just required you to do it. And she said, "No. More important is mental prayer, engaging directly with God, sitting down, finding a spot, closing out everything, all distractions, and beginning the process of recollection, moving inside and dialoguing with God. And that's exactly what she says. It's a conversation with God. So, so when Teresa begins founding convents, it's problematical. It's problematical because she's teaching a new kind of spirituality. She's not the only one who's teaching it. Juan de Avila is teaching it. Pedro de Alcántara is teaching it. Ignatius is teaching a new kind of spirituality that in some ways is similar. And she was very influenced by Ignatian spirituality. But there was a need for this. She felt a need for it. She felt that she was doing God's work. And so she continued founding these convents. At one point, she was put under house arrest, and she went to Toledo. She had to stay there. She wasn't allowed to found any more convents. But eventually she was released by the king. She had a tremendous following, and then she continued founding convents, but it was not without opposition. Even when she was canonized, there were clerics who said that her teachings were diabolical, or that no woman could be as smart as she appeared to be. She must be inspired by the devil. So, and many people wanted her to become the new patron saint of Spain. Santiago de Compostela is the patron saint of Spain. It was just a scandal that a woman should be proposed as the patron saint. Even people like Quevedo opposed it. Quevedo, one of Spain's greatest poets and prose writers, novelists. So she did not, that honor was not bestowed on her. She was not named patron saint of Spain. So that's a really long answer to your question, but it's a complex question.
It is a complex question, and it touches on, as you mentioned, sort of the history that was going on, and even, as you mentioned, Ignatius Loyola, who himself was put under Inquisition, and suspicions around being part of the Alumbrados, those who claim some sort of illumination. Michael Scott, who runs this wonderful series, has a number of questions that focus around how was she received given in the church, given the movement in Protestantism, which would take kind of a more individualized, kind of a move away from Rome, a move away from structures. How was she received? Do you have a sense at the time within the church, and how were those accommodations met? While also
they weren't met. She was she's named in 6 different inquisitional inquiries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't just, oh yeah, this is a nice idea, we should go ahead and incorporate it. Not at all. There was a radical reaction against Teresa. She in her own order, in the Carmelite order, before it was divided into discalcs and calcs, the Carmelite general, Rubeo, who's called in Spain, felt extremely threatened by this. The church felt extremely threatened by this. I mean, she met in Avila with a group of reformers, but there, and she had and didn't have the support of this group. Some of them thought that she had been inspired by the devil when she started having ecstatic episodes. They said that she was inspired by the devil, and she began to think herself that she was possessed. What happened was, in 1554, the Jesuits founded a colegio, a kind of seminary in Avila, a school. And with them came Jesuit confessors. And one of her best friends took a Jesuit confessor, and so Teresa did as well. And his name was Diego de Cetina. He was much younger than she, uh, but but he believed her. He believed that she wasn't possessed, that her inspiration was not the devil. This was actually before she started founding convents, but she had visions and she had these episodes of ecstasy, and he believed that she was inspired by God, but he wasn't sure because he was young. So when he left, he was ill, and he left, and another one came, Juan de Platanos, and then he was older, and he became uh, a more enlightened guide. And she doesn't ever say that she did the spiritual exercises, but I think it's pretty clear from the way she describes some of her spiritual practices that she was exposed to them. I know that a lot of her spiritual daughters were exposed to the spiritual exercises. Uh, and so he encouraged her, and she began to gain confidence in herself. Finally, Borja, Francisco de Borja, who came to be the third Father General of the Jesuits, came to Avila. This was way before he was that. He was a very influential man, and he met her, and he was very taken with her, and he believed also that she was inspired by God, and that was um, the seal of approval. That's what she needed to be able to continue with her uh, with with her spiritual development. So, then after that, it wasn't until 1562 that she founded her first convent. But she had the support of some key people. Francisco de Borja was one of them. Pedro de Alcántara was another one. She had Juan de Avila was another influential man, who at first was very leery of Teresa, but eventually came on board. So, but she had the opposition when she first started. When she founded her first convent, she had the opposition of almost everybody. The city of Avila was completely opposed to her founding a new convent because she founded in poverty, and they said they would never be able to support a new convent. They said they already had convents that were founded in poverty, and a new one would be absolutely too expensive and too difficult to maintain. The new convent had exactly 4 women in it. It was not a massively large convent. It was a tiny little convent with 4 women. So that was obviously an excuse. She had the opposition of the women in La Encarnacion, the convent that she currently resided in, because they said, well, does she think she's better than we are? Does she think this convent isn't good enough for her? And some of these women were from the best families in Avila. They were very angry. And she had the opposition of the provincial Angel de Salazar, because she went over his head. He didn't want her to found a convent, so she went over his head and got permission from Rome to found this convent. So there was a lot of opposition. It wasn't just that she founded the new convent, everybody was happy.
Right. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we could go on for a long time, but our question time has come to an end. I'm going to hand it over to Michael in a minute, but just to point out that she died in 1582 and was canonized some 40 years later in 1622, along with Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier. So those affinities between the society and her founding of the Descalzed Carmelites were rich. And also maybe just based on what you were saying, of in spite of opposition, was able to kind of renew the church and draw people unto herself. And renew the church. That could be a good message for us today in our own challenges that we have. So thank you very much, Professor Mujica. And I'm going to hand it over now to Michael Scott back in Oxford.
Well, thank you, Professor Mujica. It was a really great informative session, and she was clearly a very strong, wonderful woman to be able to be able to do all of that. And I go back to Angela Preston's statement, really, that to be able to do that in a male-orientated society and a dominant male church was quite amazing. So thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you also, Father Joe, for such an enjoyable event. I've really enjoyed it sitting here listening. Our next event in this series will be on Tuesday, the 8th of February, when Professor Mark Bosco will be returning. You'll remember that he talked to us about Flannery O'Connor earlier in our series, and this time he'll be talking about Graham Greene. There are two further events that you might like to note. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, in association with the Future of Humanities Project, will be on Monday, the 24th of January at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. BST, where we will be discussing whether in old age we are forever young or newly vulnerable. And there will be a Zoom in our China series on Friday, the 21st of January at 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. BST, when Michelle Wang from Georgetown, University, Washington, will be discussing Buddhist art on the Silk Road. We would like to thank those at Georgetown who have made this happen, especially our administrators, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon, who work to make Zoom presentations possible. Further, our thanks at Georgetown to Dr. Jack Tajoya, the President, Dr. Tom Banchoff, the Vice President of Global Affairs. At Campion Hall to Dr. Nick Austin, SJ, Master of the Campion Hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Companion Hall administrators. At Blackfriars to Dr. Richard Finn, OP, Director of the Las Casas Institute, and Dr. John O'Connor, the Regent of the Hall, and Kinga Rona Gabnai, our administrator. My thanks, as always, to Maggie Scott for all the help she gives me in putting these things together. Finally, our thanks to you for being part of the audience. Please join us again for some of the events that I've just mentioned. In the meantime, take care and keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all, and goodbye.